This year has been an up and down year for federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He's back in the House of Commons as leader of the official opposition and got an overwhelming show of support from delegates at the party's convention in Calgary, but his party support is stalling in national polls, and the Carney Liberals could garner a majority with a series of by-election wins. Poilievre recently embarked on a trip to the US where he met with officials and business leaders and culminated in a highly publicized appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post politics reporter Stephanie Taylor joins me to discuss why Poilievre opted to make an appearance on Rogan's podcast, why it was potentially a political win, and whether the appearance helps sell him to potential voters in Canada. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Stephanie, there's been a lot of talk the last few days, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it, about Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's appearance on the most popular podcast in the world, the Joe Rogan Experience, but also I'm hoping we can get into a little bit about the state of federal politics, especially in the wake of this speech. So I guess for starters, we'll go back to Joe Rogan and Pierre Poilievre. You know, heading into the interview with Rogan last week, for a guy like Pierre Poilievre, and how things have been for him in the last year, heading out of last spring's federal election, what makes an interview like this appealing to the Conservative leader at this point?
I think it's two things. One is audience. Joe Rogan has, I think, the biggest podcast in the world, some millions and millions of followers. And I think what was really interesting is going into this podcast, the federal Conservatives and the team around Mr. Poilievre were really kind of hyping this up. Like, they wanted people to be watching this. They were spreading the message kind of loud and clear. Steve Outhouse, who is the campaign manager for the Conservatives, sent a memo that was shared with media, and he sent it to all the Conservative candidates and caucus members saying, tune into this podcast. So clearly they saw this podcast as a chance to reach a lot of people, not just in the US, but also in Canada. And this, of course, is coming at a time where Mr. Poilievre, as the official opposition leader, is having a bit of a difficult time just getting attention on what it is that he is saying, between what Mr. Donald Trump is doing in Iran and the ongoing trade war and upcoming negotiations around Kuzma and what Prime Minister McCartney's government is doing. Like, there's just not a lot of room for Mr. Poilievre as an opposition leader to get his message heard, particularly when it comes to the Canada-US issue, one that he has been criticized on in the past, including from within the Conservative tent, for not addressing more directly. So I think audience was a big topic, as well as this interview took place in Austin in the context of Mr. Poilievre's first tour in the US since he became the Conservative leader several years ago. So this was at a time when the Conservatives did really want to emphasize how he would be talking about the Canada-US relationships, tariffs, trade, whatever else the president was talking about when it came to Canada. So I think it was an opportunity to just get a lot of eyeballs on what Mr. Poilievre is saying, and particularly a platform where the Conservatives can say, look, he is talking about the Canada-US issue, not just to a Canadian audience, but to an American audience, and particularly, I think, even an American audience that if you were tuning into Joe Rogan, there's a chance that you might have voted for Trump in the last election. So kind of going right to the people who put the president in the office in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And heading into the interview, when we heard that Poilievre was going to be on the Joe Rogan Experience, there's a lot of speculation about what might be covered off or how he would acquit himself during this interview. And especially given some of the past topics that Joe Rogan has talked about, either whether through COVID or they love to make fun of the Fidel Castro, Justin Trudeau conspiracy theory. And even just listening to the interview, I had to get about 20 minutes in listening to mixed martial arts and kettlebell talk before we kind of really got to the issues. When it came to the politics of the interview, what were the standout bits of discussion for you, and how do you think they played to both a Canadian and even an American audience?
Yeah, I think to your point, I mean, this was almost a 2.5 hour interview. And the parts that the Conservatives really wanted to emphasize about trade and tariffs, they came in kind of at the first half of the interview, and were actually, I think, when you chalk it all up together, probably this made for kind of the smallest amount of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What you heard Mr. Poilievre say, though, is that he wants the president to knock it off when it comes to the 51st state comment. This came out as when Joe Rogan was asking Poilievre, like, what happened to you in the last election? He confronted Poilievre with the fact that in the States, there is this narrative that Poilievre was riding high in the polls, and suddenly Trump comes out. He starts talking about this 51st state and wanting Canada to become it. And then that really hooped Poilievre. And Mr. Poilievre used that moment to kind of directly confront and saying he wants the president to be knocking off comments like that, and legitimizing and kind of defending the fact that Canadians did feel offended. They were upset. Rogan himself said he thought it was a crazy comment, and you heard Mr. Poilievre say, yeah, because it is a crazy thing to say and a crazy thing to talk about. And Mr. Poilievre used that to kind of provide his explanation and a defense for a tariff-free relationship between Canada and the U.S., saying, look, there's ways Canada can give the U.S. things that it needs. For example, he pointed to lumber, said, we got a lot of lumber. The U.S. wants to build more housing to bring down housing costs. We can help do that. The U.S., the most popular series of trucks is the Ford F-Series. You need Canadian aluminum because you don't make some yourself, and you got to get the tariffs off of that. So I think politically, Mr. Poilievre did what he needed to do, I think, in this interview. He did talk about the Canada-U.S. relationship and kind of offered the Conservative defense for a tariff-free relationship. At the same time, to your point, he did sidestep some of the other things Rogan wanted to talk about. Rogan talked about COVID and how he thought, the opposition he had to what former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did around vaccine and mandates. And Mr. Poilievre really wasn't taking the bait on that. He engaged with that a little bit, but really tried to kind of sidestep, I think, that conversation. He also didn't really take the bait when Rogan brought up the conspiracy, even in a joking way, about Trudeau's father. You heard Mr. Poilievre say, no, his dad was Pierre Trudeau, and I didn't like him either growing up in Western Canada. So I think on both of those fronts, Conservatives were happy with what they heard, not because they essentially feel that is what Mr. Poilievre needs to be doing right now. He needs to be veering away from these more cultural, controversial, conspiratorial issues and be seen to be talking about what a lot of Canadians have on their top of mind, which is the Canada-U.S. relationship and kind of how you're going to manage Donald Trump and positioning yourself in a way that shows prospective voters that you can actually engage with that issue.
Yeah. Now, the interviewer himself, Joe Rogan, there's one big criticism about him is that, when people go on a show, he doesn't ask tough questions, or he doesn't push back when people make tough statements or kind of out there statements. And he just lets the kind of conversation flow. With Mr. Poilievre, was there any point where you felt that he either had to stand up for himself, stand up for Canada, or push back on narratives that Rogan was talking about?
I think of one exchange where Rogan and he were talking about resource development, and Mr. Poilievre was talking about energy is another area Canada and the U.S. can work more closely. Mr. Rogan started talking about, well, what about environmental concerns? And at one point, Joe Rogan says, I've seen photos in Alberta, and he's referring to the oil sands. And Rogan said, I've seen photos and they appear, quote unquote, like scorched earth. Mm-hmm. And that's when Mr. Poilievre very quickly said, no. That's not what you're seeing. And he really kind of defended the oil and gas industry and talked about the ways it's ethical, explained, these are open pit mines you're seeing in Fort Mac. So I think that was also a notable exchange that Conservatives saw and said they really liked to hear Mr. Poilievre say that. Poilievre also at another point kind of shut down. And what I would say is probably the clearest no he has given to Alberta separation, saying, it's just not going to happen. He understands that people are frustrated. He talked in the interview about being raised in Calgary. Mm-hmm. He's an MP, obviously, from in rural Alberta right now. So that was kind of another point where he maybe put his foot down a little bit or drew a line. And again, those are topics that the Conservatives were really happy to hear. I don't know if they necessarily expected that was going to be coming up, but I think that was kind of the only real, especially on the kind of the oil sands bit, was the only real exchange you kind of saw between the two of them. And I think the Conservatives and Liberals feel that Mr. Poilievre handled it well.
We'll be right back.
Baseball is back, and the first pitch is on Netflix. The New York Yankees, led by 7-time All-Star Aaron Judge, head to the San Francisco Bay to take on Rafael Devers' San Francisco Giants. This season kicks off with one exclusive opening night game. Watch MLB Opening Night, the New York Yankees versus the San Francisco Giants, live on Netflix. Tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
Get a sense that this interview has kind of been a win for Poilievre, at the very least, because everyone's talking about it. We're talking about it. It was on the news shows over the weekend in Canada. And I think people are talking about the show more than Poilievre's US visit overall. Was that the ultimate goal, to just perhaps, get people talking, get people to look at the leader in a different light and change the channel on some of the other things he's been having to deal with as Conservative leader?
I think that was one of the goals. I mean, clearly the Conservatives wanted people to see Mr. Poilievre doing this. They wanted to hear what he had to say. I think it's also worth noting that what they are hoping for is that doing a podcast like Rogan is going to be a way to reach people who are not necessarily listening to a show like this or kind of the other typical political shows. Mm-hmm. Mr. Rogan enjoys a really big audience, particularly among younger men and those who are not engaged with politics. So what the Conservatives are hoping to see happen now, especially those in kind of the political communication world, is the clips from this interview just live online forever, and that they'll pop up on people's feeds and perhaps people who aren't paying attention to what Poilievre has to say. But I think why this is being seen as such a win in some ways is this is the version of Poilievre the Conservatives want Canadians to be seeing. A Poilievre that is making his point through explanation, not confrontation, as he is often accused by critics of doing so. I think they feel that he came across as very thoughtful and more knowledgeable in kind of a longer form interview. I think they like this version of Poilievre where he is not revisiting the past or, whether that's around COVID, whether that's around Justin Trudeau. Even I think losing the last election, which Rogan brought up several times, Poilievre said, Canadians do things through evolution and not revolution. He did not launch into an explanation as to here's all the big wins the Conservatives saw during the last election, and here's and kind of relitigating the past. So I think the question for the Conservatives now is, can Mr. Poilievre do this consistently, right? Rogan was a particular platform. It's a 2.5-hour podcast. It's relaxed. It's friendly. You got a bit, you got to learn how much Mr. Poilievre likes fitness and kettlebells and how much he thinks about this and like some of his personal workout stuff. But when it comes to his political messaging, I think there's a lot of Conservatives that do want to see whether Mr. Poilievre can carry this on a consistent basis going forward. I was talking to one Conservative who said, like, where was this version of him during the last election campaign, right? So I think if there is any criticism coming from within the tent on this one, some of that criticism is going to be, is this too little too late? Should he have been going on a platform like this? Should he have been sending these messages on the Canada-US relationship, or maybe even kind of sidestepping some of these more controversial and cultural comments a bit earlier, or when it really mattered, say during last year's spring election?
Yeah, and the timing of it is interesting. And, I assume that Joe Rogan interviews are booked out well in advance, right? It's a popular podcast. He probably sets an agenda. And politics in Canada is kind of ever changing, especially lately with a minority government. And we've seen the Liberals racking up floor crossings and putting themselves in position for a majority, especially with some looming by-elections. On the too little too late question, even if it was a positive interview and seen as a win, does it move the needle at all, especially if we get to a point where the Liberals win the by-elections that they're expected to win and move into majority territory? this seemed like a pre-election interview in a way. And do we get stuck now with an interview that did really well for him, but doesn't mean a lot in the grand scheme of things because he can't use that as a jumping off point for an election that people thought might be coming this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the challenge for the Conservatives right now. I mean, you look at just what successive public polling has showed. The Liberals are kind of at an all-time high. I think the last time they were even this high in the polls was like at the beginning of former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's, entry and tenure as Prime Minister. So this is a really challenging moment for Conservatives. And I was chatting with a Conservative MP the other day about this interview who said, look, like, we need to be reaching out to boomer men and older women. That's not necessarily the Rogan audience. So the voters who, whether they're traditional Conservative voters who decided to give Mark Carney a chance in the last election, or they're just Liberals and those who do not like what Mr. Poilievre kind of stands for, and they don't necessarily see him as a prime minister, that is still the voter coalition that the Conservatives, whenever that next election rolls around, has to be able to kind of get them to see and consider whether returning to the Conservative tent or voting Conservative that maybe they in the way that they haven't in the past. So certainly I think everyone says this is a good interview, but it's a really challenging political landscape for Mr. Poilievre right now. When it comes to these by-elections, we have 3 by-elections, 2 in kind of Liberal strongholds within Toronto, and then there's one in Montreal that was recently overturned by the Supreme Court with like a razor-thin 1-vote margin, was just going to be, I think, seen as a tight battle between the Liberals and the Bloc Québécois. But with Mr. Carney looking like, at least with the 2 Toronto area seats, these are Liberal strongholds, should that remain the case, he is well on his way to kind of getting the majority mark in terms of numbers. What that does for the Conservatives and for the opposition, well, that gives Mr. Poilievre time. Now, a lot of Conservative strategists will say that's a good thing for him, because if you're the Conservatives right now, you don't want to be going into a spring election with the numbers as high as they are for the Liberals, and it gives Mr. Poilievre time to maybe see the Canada-US issue diminish a little bit, or not be as much in the forefront as it is this year, not just what Mr. Trump is doing in Iran or the comments he's made about Greenland, but with the upcoming CUSMA renewal and talks, that relationship and trade is going to be dominating. So perhaps giving Mr. Poilievre more time is only for the advantage. At the same time, I think there is an argument or a question to be had about how are Conservatives going to continue to feel 6 or 9 months or a year from now if polling remains the same, which is showing that there is a high level of satisfaction among Canadians for what the Prime Minister is saying and doing. This is a Prime Minister that's doing a lot of the same things the Conservative leader himself has talked about doing and promised to do. What does that mean for Mr. Poilievre 9 months from now? If numbers do not seem to be moving and he is not able to kind of, and if there still is criticism about whether he is a leader that can effectively provide an alternative to Prime Minister Mark Carney.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a tough place for a Conservative leader to be in, especially after getting some goodwill, or at least some good press out of it, an interview like that with Joe Rogan. But, a week is a lifetime in Canadian politics. We'll see how the next several go as we head toward these by-elections and what transpires in the aftermath. Stephanie, thanks very much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Stephanie Taylor. More from her at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breckenridge. Thanks for listening.